The dust of Colorado carried a strange heaviness that morning. Dry, brittle, and sharp, it clung to the air like a warning. Henry Walker leaned on the weather-worn fence of his small ranch just outside Salida, the timber creaking beneath his weight. 68 years old, his back was bent but still unbroken, his eyes steady but heavy with miles of memory. He had lived through darker storms than drought and debt, yet this one pressed down with a suffocating silence. The sun was barely above the ridgeline, painting the Arkansas River Valley in pale orange. Out in the corral, the white Mustang lifted his head. Spirit, a wild Kiger stallion, once branded untamable, now the heartbeat of Henry's days. The horse's coat shimmered like snow against the dusty ground, and when his dark eyes found Henry's, there was an understanding few men would ever believe possible. Henry's lips pulled into the faintest smile. "Morning, boy," he murmured, voice gravelly from decades of cigarettes and silence. Spirit nickered, trotting forward with that mixture of caution and confidence only the wild kept alive. No halter, no rope, just trust. Henry slipped an apple slice from his pocket, his palm open and flat. Spirit's lips brushed against his skin, delicate despite the power carried in his body. For a moment, the world was quiet, almost kind. Then came the crunch of tires on gravel. Henry stiffened, his hand still resting against Spirit's neck. A sedan rolled through the ranch gate, far too polished for this place. Out stepped a man in a pressed shirt and shiny shoes that had never known manure or mud. Thomas Green, the bank's representative. Henry didn't need to check his watch. He knew exactly why Thomas had come, and it wasn't for conversation. "Morning, Mr. Walker," Thomas called, trying to soften his tone. He carried a leather folder tucked under his arm like a weapon dressed as business. "Sorry to drop in so early." Henry patted Spirit once, then pulled himself away from the corral, boots dragging through dirt. "Bit early for paperwork, don't you think?" His voice carried no anger, just the rough dignity of a man tired of losing ground. Thomas's eyes flickered, guilt visible even through his professional mask. "I wish it were just paperwork." He opened the folder, shuffling a sheaf of documents. The board met yesterday. With the market the way it is, hay prices tripling, foreclosures all over Chaffee County, they've decided to accelerate the process. You have until Friday, 3 days. Either pay the arrears in full or vacate the property. The words settled like stones in Henry's chest. He didn't argue. War had taught him long ago the futility of fighting bullets with bare hands. He took the papers, heavy as they were, and tucked them under his arm. His face didn't change, but Spirit in the corral tossed his head, as if sensing the tremor beneath Henry's calm. "What about the horses?" Henry asked quietly. "They'll go to auction. Any proceeds, after debt settlement, will be yours." Thomas shifted his weight. Both men knew that meant nothing. Older rescues brought pennies. Slaughter buyers prowled every sale ring. Henry's herd would be scattered, their fate sealed in trucks headed south of the border. Thomas cleared his throat. "I'm sorry, Henry. I really did try." Henry offered the faintest nod. "Appreciate you coming yourself." He extended his hand. The banker shook it, then retreated to his car, relief etched on his face for escaping the weight of the moment. The sedan disappeared down the road, leaving dust hanging in the summer air. Henry stood alone by the fence. Spirit pressed his muzzle against his shoulder, warm breath threading through the thin fabric of Henry's shirt. "Looks like we're in trouble, boy," Henry whispered. "I don't know how to fix this one." That night, the ranch house felt emptier than usual. The old kitchen table was buried under unpaid bills, the foreclosure notice staring at him like a final verdict. His military pension barely stretched to cover the basics. The feed store account was overdrawn. He had already sold his truck, his wife's jewelry, even the shotgun his father had given him. The only things left were the horses, 6 rescues, and Spirit, his ragtag family. The thought of sending them to auction tightened his chest until he could hardly breathe. He rubbed his temples, the old nightmares stirring the pop of distant gunfire, the shriek of mortars in Afghan valleys, the echo of orders barked too late. But then came another sound, softer, the steady rhythm of hooves outside, Spirit pacing under the moonlight. That sound pulled him back, grounded him, just as it had countless times when sleep clawed at his sanity. He rose, stared out the window. Spirit stood apart from the others, moonlight turning his white coat into silver fire. Henry swallowed hard. He couldn't consign that horse to the slaughter pipeline. Spirit deserved better. Maybe, just maybe, he could bring enough at auction to secure a small rental in town, something to start over with. The thought was a knife to his chest, but it was the only blade he had left. With calloused fingers, Henry picked up the phone. The line crackled before connecting. "Caleb," he said, voice low, "I've got a horse for Friday's sale." On the other end, Caleb Turner, longtime friend and auctioneer, paused. You talking about Spirit? Henry's silence was answer enough. You sure, Hank? That horse is… I'm out of options. Caleb exhaled slowly. All right, if you want the best shot, I'll set the opening bid at $1. Henry frowned. $1? You trying to give him away? No, I'm trying to get people's blood pumping. A $1 Mustang will have the whole county buzzing. Trust me, bids will climb. Henry closed his eyes, picturing Spirit. The absurdity cut deep. Fine, he whispered, do it. He hung up before doubt could change his mind. The next morning dawned with cruel beauty. Sunlight painted the Sangre de Cristo mountains in crimson, mocking Henry's somber mood. He moved through his chores like a man condemned, filling water troughs, scattering hay, checking hooves. The rescues greeted him with knickers, unaware that their sanctuary was crumbling. Spirit trailed him, head high, nostrils flaring, a sentinel who knew something was wrong. By noon, the rumor had already spread through Salida. At Maggie's diner, a waitress leaned over the counter whispering, "You hear? Walker's putting that white Mustang up for $1." At the feed store, ranch hands shook their heads in disbelief. By evening, it was on the front page of the Salida Chronicle, the $1 Mustang, a veteran's last stand. Rachel Porter, the reporter, had stopped by unannounced, pen scribbling as Henry reluctantly told her bits of the story. She took photographs of Spirit, the Mustang's regal stance caught against the fading light. Henry had muttered, "Just make sure they know he deserves a good home." Rachel promised she would. Now, with the newspaper ink barely dry, strangers were already calling, some offering cash, others sniffing for a bargain. Henry turned them all down. "Auction only," he repeated, his voice flat. Each rejection weighed heavier, as though he was daring fate to take its cruelest swing. That evening, he brushed Spirit until the horse gleamed white against the dusk. Spirit stood still, eyes half closed, leaning into Henry's hand. For a few minutes, it was as if none of the world's burdens existed, just man and horse, survivors, scarred but standing. Then Henry's phone buzzed. A text from Caleb, paperwork filed, Friday, lot 47, $1 start. Trust me. Henry slid the phone back into his pocket, staring at Spirit under the rising moon. $1, he muttered, bitterness coating his tongue. They'll never understand, boy. They'll never understand what you're worth. Spirit snorted, tossing his mane, the sound sharp in the quiet night. Henry reached out, pressed his forehead against the horse's, eyes closing against the ache. The papers from the bank lay waiting inside. 3 days. 3 days to say goodbye to the only place that had ever felt like home. 3 days before the world judged Spirit's worth with numbers shouted in a crowded ring. Henry whispered into the darkness, his voice trembling, though no one was there to hear. Maybe this is the only way. But God help me, what if I'm wrong? The wind shifted, carrying the distant sound of laughter from town, the echoes of a community already buzzing about the spectacle to come. Henry straightened, the weight of decision pressing harder than any battlefield. He knew Friday would bring a crowd, but what he didn't know, what no one knew, was who would walk through those auction doors, and how a single bid might alter not just his future, but Spirit's fate, and the soul of the entire town. Who would claim the $1 Mustang? The story of the $1 Mustang spread through Salida like wildfire on dry grass. By sunrise the following day, it was no longer just Henry Walker's burden, it had become everyone's conversation. At Maggie's diner, the heart of town, the clink of coffee cups was drowned out by hushed voices and sharp whispers. "Can you believe it?" a rancher muttered over bacon and eggs. "Walker's putting that white Mustang up for $1. A damn dollar." The waitress, a young woman with tired eyes, leaned in. "I saw that horse once, shiny as snow. He's not just some bronc, he's different." At the feed store, old men leaning against sacks of grain shook their heads, their faces creased by years of sun and skepticism. "Never thought I'd see Hank Walker let go of that horse," one of them said. "Man must be desperate." By afternoon, the news had taken root. It was no longer a local curiosity, it was a spectacle in the making. Families whispered about driving out to see the auction as if it were a traveling show. Traders sniffed profit. Rescue groups scrambled to raise funds. And in the quiet corners of VFW Hall, fellow veterans spoke of Henry with a mix of pride and sorrow. But for Henry himself, the attention felt like a weight pressing tighter with every passing hour. He had never asked to be the center of anything. He preferred silence, the company of horses, the smell of hay over the noise of men. Now the town's eyes were fixed on him and on Spirit, as though both were caught in a ring long before the auction bell. That evening, a knock rattled his front door. Henry hesitated before opening it, half expecting another banker or opportunist. Instead, he found a young woman clutching a notepad, her brown hair pulled into a messy bun, camera bag slung over her shoulder. "Mr. Walker?" she asked. Henry narrowed his eyes. "Depends who's asking." Rachel Porter, reporter with the Salida Chronicle. She hesitated, glancing toward the corral where Spirit stood gleaming in the fading light. "I'd like to hear your story. People deserve to understand what's really happening." Henry's jaw tightened. "Not much to tell. Bank's taking the ranch. Horses go to auction. That's it." Rachel stepped forward, her tone gentler. "But it's not just a story about a foreclosure. It's about you, a veteran, a man who gave half his life to this country, and a horse people are already calling the $1 Mustang. Don't you want folks to know what he means to you?" Henry wanted to slam the door. He wanted to keep the pain his own, locked away where no one could prod it. But then he looked past her to Spirit, standing proud and still. If this was his last stand, maybe Spirit deserved more than silence. He exhaled, long and weary. "You got 5 minutes." They walked to the corral as the sky bled into purple. Rachel scribbled furiously as Henry spoke in clipped sentences. He told her about Spirit's first days on the ranch, a bundle of wild nerves and distrust. How he had chosen not to break the horse, but to wait, to earn his trust. How Spirit had kept him alive on nights when the old war clawed at his chest. Rachel asked questions, her eyes flicking between Henry and the horse. "Do you see yourself in him?" Henry gave her a sharp look. He didn't like being read like a book. Yet, he couldn't deny the truth. "We both got scars," he admitted finally. "Difference is, his are on the outside. Mine," he trailed off, tapping 2 fingers against his temple. "Mine don't show up in pictures." Rachel lowered her pen. "That's the story, Mr. Walker. People need to hear that." Henry snorted. "People don't care. They'll just see a price tag." "Maybe," Rachel said softly, "but sometimes words can change what people see." The next morning, the Chronicle hit the stands. On the front page was a photograph. Spirit bathed in golden dusk, mane flowing like white fire, Henry's hand resting on his shoulder. The headline read, "The $1 Mustang, a veteran's last stand." Within hours, the phones at the auction house began to ring. Some callers demanded to know if the story was true. Others offered thousands up front, eager to snatch Spirit before Friday. Caleb Turner, the auctioneer, fielded them all with the same line: "Public sale only, lot 47, Friday at noon." At the diner, Rachel's article was folded open on every table. Mothers pointed at the picture, whispering to their children. Old-timers wiped their eyes before hiding behind their coffee cups. And in the quiet back booth, Maggie Holloway read the story with lips pressed tight, her eyes glinting with something between sorrow and resolve. Henry, meanwhile, wanted to crawl into the earth. Everywhere he went, people stared. At the feed store, a man slapped him on the back. "Hell of a move, Hank. That $1 start's gonna make history," Henry muttered. "Wasn't for history," and left without buying a thing. At the gas station, a teenage boy approached shyly. "Mister, that horse, he's beautiful. My mom says she hopes someone saves him." Henry nodded, throat tight. He couldn't explain that saving Spirit might mean losing him forever. That night, Henry sat on the porch, the newspaper folded on his lap. Spirit grazed quietly under the stars, calm as ever. The old veteran shook his head. "They think it's just a story," he whispered. "They don't know what it costs." 2 days before the auction, Rachel returned. She wasn't carrying her notepad this time, only a small recorder. "Mr. Walker," she said, "people from Denver are calling. Even Colorado Springs. Your story's spreading. There's talk rescue groups might show up at the sale. You've struck a chord." Henry's lips thinned. "Didn't mean to." "Sometimes the truth works that way," Rachel replied. Then, after a pause, "What do you want, Henry? When that gavel falls, what do you hope happens?" Henry stared at Spirit. The horse raised his head, ears flicking toward them, as if listening. "I want him safe," Henry said finally. "I don't care what happens to me, just him." Rachel nodded, recorder light blinking red. "That's the line, Mr. Walker. That's the heart of it." The following day, the Chronicle ran a follow-up. A veteran's plea, save the Mustang. It wasn't begging. It was truth, laid bare. A man at the end of his rope asking only for his horse to be spared. The story was picked up by regional radio. Online forums buzzed. Rescue advocates organized carpools. The auction that was usually a dusty, half-empty affair was about to become the most crowded in county history. Henry sat in his kitchen, staring at the article. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. He unplugged it, silence settling heavy in the house. He didn't want to be a symbol, he just wanted peace. But peace had slipped too far to reach. Out in the corral, Spirit tossed his mane and pawed the dirt, restless. Henry walked out, laying a hand on his warm neck. You're causing a storm you don't even know about, boy." Spirit leaned into him, breathing steady. Henry closed his eyes, listening, grounding himself. Yet, even as he stood there, he could feel the ground shifting beneath them. This wasn't just his fight anymore. The whole town was invested. And with that came danger, the kind that money and greed always brought. Friday loomed like a storm on the horizon. The auction house was preparing for crowds bigger than it had ever seen. Trucks and trailers would pour in from miles around. Some would come with hope, some with wallets fat with cash, others with knives hidden behind their smiles. That night, as Henry latched Spirit's gate, headlights swept across the dirt road. A black pickup slowed near the fence, lingering a second too long before rolling away. Henry froze, hand on the latch, unease settling in his gut. He whispered to Spirit, "Looks like we're not just drawing attention from good folks anymore." And as the horse snorted, the question pressed harder than ever. When the bidding starts, who will truly be reaching for Spirit, those who want to save him, or those who want to claim him? The morning of the auction broke sharp and clear, the kind of autumn dawn that cut through a man's bones. Henry Walker had been awake since before the first hint of light, sitting in silence at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He had dressed in his cleanest shirt, though the collar was frayed, and polished his old boots until they shone, not for himself, for Spirit. When he stepped outside, the air smelled of frost and dust. In the corral, Spirit stood waiting, mane bright as morning fire, eyes fixed on Henry like he somehow understood what was coming. The old veteran took a deep breath, pushing down the heaviness in his chest. "Time to face it, boy," he murmured, running a hand along the mustang's neck. "Let's walk this road together." By 8 o'clock, Caleb Turner's trailer rattled into the yard. The auctioneer stepped down, his hat pulled low against the Sunday. "You ready, Hank?" Caleb asked, voice gruff but kind. "As I'll ever be." Henry led Spirit toward the trailer. The horse hesitated at the ramp, ears flicking, nostrils flaring at the smell of metal and strange hay. Henry steadied him with a hand on his cheek. "Easy, just one more ride." Spirit blew out a breath and stepped forward, trusting. Henry swallowed hard, securing him loosely inside. When the door shut, the sound echoed like finality. The drive into town blurred by. Henry's old truck followed behind Caleb's rig, dust curling in the wake of the tires. He barely saw the pastures rolling by, the barns and fence lines of neighbors who would soon know he'd lost everything. All he could hear was the hollow ticking of the dashboard clock, counting down the last hours with the horse that had saved him. When they reached the auction yard, Henry was stunned. He had expected a small crowd, the usual traders and ranchers. Instead, the parking lot overflowed. Trucks lined the road for a quarter mile. Families climbed out with children tugging at their sleeves. Local TV vans idled near the gates, antennas glinting in the Sunday. Rachel Porter stood near the entrance, notepad in hand, snapping quick photos. She caught Henry's eye and gave him a small nod of encouragement. He returned it stiffly, not trusting his voice. Caleb guided Spirit into a separate pen behind the barn. Already, a small crowd had gathered, murmuring as the white Mustang tossed his head, light catching on his mane. "That's him, the dollar horse," someone whispered. Henry stepped close, resting his hand on Spirit's muzzle. "Ignore the noise, boy. Just keep your head high." Inside the auction hall, the air buzzed. Every seat was filled, people standing shoulder to shoulder along the walls. The usual low chatter before a sale was replaced with something sharper. Anticipation, curiosity, even reverence. The smell of dust, sweat, and coffee mingled with the sound of boots scraping wood. Henry found a seat near the front, beside his neighbor Bill Matthews. "Never seen a turnout like this," Bill muttered. "Whole damn county showed up." Henry only nodded, jaw tight. His pulse hammered with every lot that passed. Cattle bawled, sheep bleated, numbers rattled off by the auctioneer in a blur. None of it registered. His whole world narrowed to the moment Caleb would bring Spirit through that gate. Finally, it came. Caleb appeared, leading Spirit into the ring. The Mustang shone against the dark wood, head high, muscles rippling with each step. A ripple went through the crowd, a sound halfway between awe and surprise. Even the children quieted. The auctioneer raised his hand. "Ladies and gentlemen, Lot 47, 5-year-old Kiger Mustang gelding, gentled and trained by our own local veteran, Henry Walker. You've read about him in the Chronicle. This here's the $1 Mustang, and as promised, we start the bidding at $1. For a heartbeat, silence. Then a hand shot up. $1. Now 5, now 10. The chant rolled like thunder. 20, 50, 100. The numbers leapt. Henry sat rigid, his hand gripping the chair so hard his knuckles went white. His breath came shallow. 200, 300, 500. Spirit turned once in the ring, calm under the noise, his eyes finding Henry's in the crowd. It was the same look he had given in the corral that morning, steady, trusting. Henry's chest tightened. 700? 8? 9? 1,000? The crowd gasped, then pressed harder. 1,500! Shouted a man in a wide-brimmed hat. 2,000! Came a woman's voice from the back. Henry craned his neck. She was tall, silver hair tied in a neat bun, her clothes sharp but practical. He didn't know her, but her eyes never left Spirit. The numbers climbed, higher than anyone had expected. 3,000, 4, 5. At 5,000, only 2 bidders remained. The silver-haired woman and the man in the hat. 5,000, do I hear 50? 50 now? 6,000. The woman lifted her hand without hesitation. 6,000! The man in the hat scowled, then shook his head. The auctioneer's gavel cracked. Sold. $6,000 to the lady in the back. For a moment, the hall was silent. Then applause erupted, a wave of clapping and murmurs. Henry barely heard it. He sat frozen, the number ringing in his ears. 6,000. Enough to cover rent for a year. Enough to start again. But all he felt was hollow, because Spirit was gone. When the crowd spilled outside, Henry stayed seated until most had left. Finally, Caleb approached, envelope in hand. Hell of a sale, Hank. More than I thought possible. She's waiting for you outside, wants a word. Henry blinked. Who? The buyer. Maggie Holloway. Owns Silver Creek Ranch north of town. You'll want to hear what she's got to say. Outside, near the loading pens, Maggie stood watching Spirit. The Mustang paced calmly, but his eyes tracked Henry as he approached. Mr. Walker, Maggie said, extending a hand. Maggie Holloway, I believe I just bought your horse. Henry shook her hand, surprised by the calluses he felt despite her refined appearance. You paid more than fair, ma'am. He's a fine horse. Maggie studied him, then Spirit, then back again. He is. But I didn't buy him for his bloodlines or his shine. I bought him because of what you built with him. Henry frowned. Not sure I follow. I read Rachel Porter's article, Maggie said softly, and I watched you in that ring today. That horse looks for you. Not for the crowd, not for the money. For you. That bond, it's rare, and it shouldn't be broken. Henry felt the words hit deep, though he didn't dare believe them. What are you saying, ma'am? Maggie's eyes held steady, her voice calm but certain. I'm saying, Mr. Walker, that I didn't just buy Spirit. I'm offering you a place too. Silver Creek has been looking for someone like you for the horses, and for something bigger. Henry blinked. Bigger? She smiled faintly. A program. Veterans, mustangs, healing. I think Spirit was meant to lead us there, but only if you'll come with him. Henry's breath caught. He looked at Spirit, who pressed against the gate, ears pricked, waiting. The idea seemed impossible, too sudden, too generous. Yet, there it was, laid bare. And the question burned. Was this really the end of Henry's story with Spirit, or the beginning of something neither of them could have imagined? The auction grounds had begun to empty, leaving behind dust and scraps of hay scattered like confetti after a parade. Henry Walker stood near the loading pens, still stunned, Spirit's soft knickers cutting through the fading noise. Maggie Holloway hadn't moved from her place, hands resting lightly on the rail, as if she were not only observing Spirit but measuring Henry's soul. Her silver hair caught the afternoon light, her posture steady and purposeful. You said something back there, Henry muttered, his voice rough. About not just buying him. What did you mean? Maggie's lips curved into a quiet smile. Exactly what I said. I don't want Spirit without you. The two of you are a package deal. I've seen a lot of horses in my life, Mr. Walker, and a lot of horsemen. But what I saw today, that bond is something worth protecting and expanding. Henry shifted, uncomfortable. I'm not much for expanding. Lost my ranch, barely keeping myself together. Don't think I'm the man you're looking for. On the contrary, Maggie said, you're exactly the man I'm looking for. She told him about Silver Creek Ranch, 2,000 acres north of town, a place known for its breeding stock and state-of-the-art facilities. But beneath the polished reputation, Maggie had a vision. I want to start something new, she explained. A program for mustangs, to prove they can be more than wild creatures in holding pens, to give them a second chance. And I want to connect that work with veterans, men and women who, like you, carry scars most folks can't see. Henry felt his throat tighten. Why veterans? Her eyes softened. Because I was married to one. My husband, Robert, came back from Vietnam, broken in ways I didn't understand until it was too late. Horses gave him moments of peace. If he'd had something like this, maybe his story would have ended differently. The silence stretched. Spirit nudged the gate, breaking the weight of her words. Maggie reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a business card and held it out. Silver Creek needs a manager. Comes with a cabin, steady pay, and all the horses you can handle. Most importantly, it comes with a chance to stay with Spirit. Henry stared at the card as though it might burn through his fingers. "Why me?" he asked finally. "Because you already proved you know what can't be taught," Maggie said simply. "Trust, patience, respect. That horse is proof." Henry looked at Spirit, who watched him with ears pricked, calm in the chaos of the day. That same trust, hard-earned and unshakable, stared back at him. "Think about it," Maggie added, her tone softening. "We'll load him into my trailer either way, but I'd rather have you in the truck behind us." That night, Henry sat in his empty kitchen, the business card on the table beside the auction envelope filled with bills. $6,000. Enough to rent a place for a while, maybe start again. But what then? More silence, more nights with coffee gone cold, and the weight of ghosts pressing against his chest. He rubbed his hand across his face. "You're too old for this," he muttered. Starting over again. But when he closed his eyes, he saw Spirit being led away by strangers, his ears searching for Henry's voice. The thought cut deeper than he cared to admit. By midnight, Henry had made his choice. The following morning, he drove north. The mountains unfolded before him, sharp against a pale blue sky. After 40 miles, he turned onto a gravel road, marked by an ornate iron arch that read, Silver Creek Ranch. The sight stole his breath. Rolling pastures stretched across the valley, dotted with horses grazing under white fences. Barns gleamed red and white in the distance, orderly as a soldier's formation. This wasn't just a ranch, it was an empire. Maggie was waiting at the main barn. Spirit stood nearby in a paddock, his coat flashing like snow under the Sunday. He lifted his head the moment Henry stepped out of the truck, trotting to the fence with a welcoming snort. Henry couldn't help but smile. "Guess you already decided for me, huh?" Maggie's smile was gentler this time. "Horses know where they belong. The question is, do you?" James, the ranch manager, appeared then. Broad-shouldered, weathered, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Holloway, the new hire?" he asked, voice edged with skepticism. Maggie answered firmly. "Yes. Henry Walker will be running the Mustang program. He'll report directly to me." James gave Henry a slow once-over, his gaze lingering on the frayed shirt, the tired lines around his eyes. "We'll see how long he lasts," he muttered, turning away. Henry bristled but kept silent. He'd dealt with worse. Maggie showed him to a small cabin tucked near the tree line. It was modest but clean, with a porch that faced the mountains. Inside, the cupboards were stocked, the bed made, a wood stove ready for fire. For the first time in weeks, Henry felt something stir in his chest that wasn't dread. That evening, he walked back to Spirit's paddock. The Mustang pressed against him with the same quiet assurance as always. Henry leaned his forehead against the horse's mane. "Looks like we've got ourselves a new mission, boy. Let's hope we're up for it." The next days passed in a blur. Maggie gave Henry freedom to settle, but James hovered, arms crossed, watching every move. The staff, mostly young trainers, whispered behind his back. To them, Henry was just an old man with war stories and one lucky Mustang. But Henry didn't bother with their approval. He rose before dawn, checked on Spirit, then wandered the barns, observing the operation. The facilities were immaculate, the horses sleek, well-fed, their training precise. Yet when he reached the Mustang barn, something was different. 8 wild horses stood in roomy stalls, their eyes wide, nostrils flaring at the scent of humans. Some paced endlessly, others stood frozen in corners. None looked settled. Henry stood quietly for a long time, then lowered himself onto an overturned bucket outside the first stall. He didn't approach, didn't speak. Just Saturday. James found him an hour later. "You planning to train them by staring contests?" he asked dryly. Henry didn't look up. "I'm planning to let them know I'm not a threat. Training comes later." James snorted. "That's not how we do things here." "Maybe that's the problem," Henry replied. By the end of the week, small shifts began. A dun mare stopped retreating when Henry approached. A bay stallion pricked his ears instead of pinning them. Spirit's calm presence nearby seemed to ripple through the others, like a steady heartbeat grounding them all. Miguel, the young trainer, cornered Henry one afternoon. "With respect, sir, we've tried patience before. These horses need firmness, boundaries." Henry met his gaze. "They've had enough firmness from a world that never gave them a choice. What they need now is a reason to trust." Miguel shook his head but said nothing more. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Henry walked to Spirit's paddock. The Mustang greeted him with a low nicker. Henry rested his arms on the fence, the weight of the day pressing on him. "Not sure how long they'll give me here," he admitted. "But if I can get through to even one of those horses, maybe Maggie's right. Maybe there's something bigger at play. Spirit nudged his shoulder, as if agreeing. Later that night, as Henry returned to his cabin, he spotted Maggie standing near the barn, speaking quietly with a man he didn't recognize. The stranger handed her a folder thick with papers. Maggie's expression was serious, almost grave, as she tucked it under her arm. When she noticed Henry watching, she offered only a faint smile before walking away into the shadows. Henry frowned, unease prickling in his chest. Spirit shifted restlessly in his paddock, ears flicking toward the distant hills. Something was stirring at Silver Creek, something Maggie hadn't told him yet, and Henry couldn't shake the question. Had he just stepped into salvation, or into a storm he didn't see coming? The mornings at Silver Creek came earlier than Henry expected. The sun had barely touched the mountains when the first whistles echoed across the ranch. Horses stirred in their paddocks, ranch hands clattered buckets along aisles, and the smell of alfalfa mixed with crisp autumn air. Henry Walker woke each day before dawn, not because he had to, but because old habits never left. Decades in the army had hardwired him to rise early, to meet the day head-on. Yet here, in the quiet cabin Maggie had given him, the mornings felt different. They weren't about orders or combat drills. They were about purpose, fragile and uncertain as it was. He always began the same way, coffee black and strong, then a walk to Spirit's paddock. The mustang greeted him with a low, rumbling nicker that settled Henry's chest in ways words never could. He would rest his forehead against Spirit's mane, breathing in the smell of earth and horse, reminding himself he wasn't alone. By the end of his first week, Henry had mapped the rhythm of the ranch. The main barns held sleek quarter horses bred for competition, shining with health and polish. The training arenas were pristine, riders moving with precision drills. Everything at Silver Creek ran like a well-oiled machine, except for the Mustang barn. That building, set slightly apart, felt like another world. 8 wild horses filled the roomy stalls, eyes wide and suspicious. Some paced endlessly, others pressed into corners, frozen like statues. When Henry first stepped inside, the noise of the ranch seemed to vanish. Only the thrum of tension remained. James, the ranch manager, gave him a skeptical look that morning. These horses have been here for months. Trainers have worked them hard, but they're still half wild. Don't expect miracles. Henry only nodded, settling onto an overturned bucket outside the dun mare's stall. He didn't speak, didn't move much, just sat, hands resting on his knees. Miguel, the young trainer, frowned. Sir, with respect, sitting around won't change a thing. We've tried patience. They need firm hands. Boundaries. Henry met his eyes calmly. They've had nothing but boundaries since the day they were rounded up. What they need now is a choice. Day after day, Henry returned. He read aloud sometimes, worn paperbacks pulled from his duffel. His voice was steady, low, filling the silence with something other than pressure. Spirit often grazed nearby, visible through an open paddock window. The wild horses would flick their ears toward him, drawn by his calm presence. At first, the others mocked. The ranch hands whispered behind Henry's back. James shook his head. Miguel smirked. But Henry didn't care. He knew trust wasn't built in a day. And then it happened. The dun mare, nervous, skittish, took a single step forward one evening as Henry sat reading. Just one. But it was toward him, not away. She stopped, nostrils flaring, eyes locked on his hand, resting open on his knee. Henry didn't move, didn't breathe too loud. Minutes ticked by. Finally, she lowered her head and sniffed his fingers before retreating again. It was nothing to most eyes. To Henry, it was everything. The next morning, Miguel found Henry brushing Spirit outside the barn. Words going around, Miguel said. They say the dun mare touched your hand. Henry shrugged. She decided to, that's all. Miguel tilted his head, skeptical but curious. We've been trying for months. You sit for a week and she comes to you? Not to me, Henry corrected. To trust. There's a difference. For the first time, Miguel didn't argue. Maggie stopped by the barn that evening. She leaned against the door, watching Henry sit quietly as the wild horses settled, their tension easing. They're different around you, she said softly. Henry closed his book, sliding it into his coat. They're just remembering what it's like to be free, even in a stall. She smiled faintly. I knew I wasn't wrong about you. Henry rubbed his palms together, uneasy with the praise. Don't thank me yet. They've got a long way to go. Don't we all? Maggie murmured. By the second week, the dun mare Henry had begun calling her Sage was approaching him daily. She would take apple slices from his open palm, retreating to chew, then step closer again. James remained unimpressed. Pretty sure. But it's slow. We don't have time for slow. Maggie overruled him. We make time. Still, the tension between James and Henry grew. James believed in efficiency. Henry believed in patience. Their philosophies clashed at every turn. Late one night, Henry spotted Maggie again, with that same stranger near the barn. The man carried a folder, thick with papers. Their voices were low, urgent, but Henry caught fragments: funding, partnership, demonstration. When they noticed him, Maggie's expression tightened, but she said nothing. The mystery gnawed at Henry, but he let it lie for now. One chilly morning, Rachel Porter arrived at Silver Creek. Notebook in hand, camera slung over her shoulder, she grinned at Henry. "Couldn't resist checking in on the $1 Mustang. Heard you're stirring things up here." Henry rolled his eyes. "Depends who you ask." Rachel snapped a photo of Spirit nudging Henry's shoulder. "You realize you've become a story again, don't you?" "I'm just trying to keep my head down." "Too late for that," Rachel said with a smirk. The breakthrough with Sage deepened. One afternoon, Henry slid into her stall, moving slow as a shadow. She tensed, but didn't bolt. He crouched low, murmuring steady words. After a long pause, she let him stroke her neck. Miguel watched from the gate, eyes wide. "She let you touch her?" Henry nodded. "Because I asked, not because I forced." The young trainer exhaled, something shifting in his expression. Respect, reluctant but real. The progress spread. The other Mustangs grew calmer when Spirit stood nearby. Their ears flicked less, their pacing slowed. Henry knew it was only the beginning, but beginnings mattered. Still, doubts haunted him. At night, in the quiet cabin, he replayed the whispers of ranch hands, James's scorn, Maggie's secret meetings. He wondered if he truly belonged here, or if Silver Creek was only a stop on the way to losing everything again. On the 15th day, Maggie summoned Henry to the main house. Dinner was already set, but her expression was serious, almost weighted. "There's something I need to tell you," she began, sliding a folder across the table. Inside were letters, proposals, and a logo Henry didn't recognize: Veterans and Mustangs Healing Initiative. Before he could ask, Maggie leaned forward. "Next week, we'll have visitors, potential partners. They want a demonstration. They need proof this program can work. And I told them, you're the one who'll show it." Henry's stomach dropped. "Show it? With horses barely touched?" Her gaze was steady. "Yes, if they believe, funding follows. Without it, this entire project dies." Henry looked down at the folder, then out the window where Spirit grazed under the moonlight. Pressure, heavy as the war he thought he left behind, pressed down again. Could he pull off the impossible, or would both he and the Mustangs be cast aside once more? The week leading up to the demonstration passed like a fuse burning slow. Each dawn at Silver Creek began with frost on the grass, breath steaming from horses' nostrils, and Henry Walker's boots crunching across gravel toward the Mustang barn. But this time, the wait wasn't only about the wild horses. It was about veterans coming to face their own demons. Henry wasn't sure which would be harder: earning the trust of Mustangs who had never known gentleness, or men who had never known peace. On Monday, Maggie handed him a sheet with names scribbled in neat handwriting. Cole Davis, 32. Afghanistan vet, nightmares, anger outbursts. Lena Brooks, 27. Medic in Iraq, panic attacks, mistrust of authority. Earl Thompson, 71. Vietnam, decades of silence, widower. "These are our first participants," Maggie said, her tone calm but her eyes betraying nerves. "They'll arrive Wednesday. I told the foundation they'd see not only the Mustangs, but how veterans and horses might heal each other." Henry looked at the list, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. "You've put a hell of a lot of faith in something untested." Maggie nodded. "So did you, when you chose to sit in front of a wild horse instead of breaking it." Wednesday came with gray skies, clouds sagging low over the mountains. A van rattled down the drive and stopped by the bunkhouse. 3 figures stepped out. Cole Davis first broad-shouldered, fists clenching and unclenching, as if ready for a fight no one else could see. His eyes flicked constantly, scanning the horizon for threats. Lena Brooks followed, small in frame but taut like a drawn bow. She carried a duffel close to her chest, avoiding everyone's gaze. Then Earl Thompson stooped, his hair silver, his movements slow. He didn't look around, he didn't look at all. Henry greeted them with a nod. "Name's Henry Walker. I'll be working with you and the horses. No uniforms here, no ranks, just ground to stand on and animals that don't lie." Cole grunted. Lena gave the barest nod. Earl said nothing. Their first session in the Mustang barn was rough. Spirit stood tethered nearby, calm and steady, his presence meant to anchor the chaos. Henry gestured toward the stalls. "These horses came off the range. They've been chased, trapped, shoved into trailers. They don't trust easy. Sound familiar?" Cole's jaw clenched. "So what? We stand around and sing Kumbaya with horses? Henry didn't flinch. So what? You give them a chance to decide if you're safe. Same as you wish the world had given you. Lena muttered. World doesn't give chances. Henry met her eyes. That's why we make our own. They spent the morning in silence, each veteran standing outside a stall. The horses shifted, wary. Cole grew restless, pacing. Lena hugged herself tighter. Earl leaned on the rail, staring at nothing. When a loud clang echoed from the far barn, Lena startled violently, her breathing jagged. The dun mare Sage spooked too, bolting to the corner of her stall. For a moment, it was chaos. Lena gasping, Sage slamming against wood, Cole barking. What the hell kind of setup is this? Henry stepped between them, voice steady. Easy. Nobody's hurt, just noise. Let the horse see you breathe. Slow. He exaggerated his inhale and exhale, shoulders rising and falling. Spirit mirrored him, calm as stone. Slowly, Sage settled. Lena's breaths began to match the rhythm, shaky but deliberate. Henry looked at her. You see? You both jumped. You both came back down. That's the start. The afternoon ended with frustration, but also a spark. Cole stomped off muttering. Lena lingered near Sage's stall, eyes softer. Earl stayed silent, but when Henry glanced his way, the old man was stroking the rail with fingers that trembled. That night, Henry sat on his porch, staring at the mountains, Spirit grazing nearby. He felt the weight of their brokenness pressing against his own. Could horses really bridge a gap that doctors, pills, and silence had failed to mend? Spirit ambled over, nudging Henry's shoulder with his muzzle. The veteran chuckled low. Yeah, you're right. One day at a time. Thursday's session brought a breakthrough. Cole, restless as ever, leaned against a stall rail, scowling. This is pointless. Henry tossed him a curry comb. Then, make yourself useful. Brush Spirit. Cole caught it, startled. I don't know how to. Doesn't matter. He knows. Just start. With visible reluctance, Cole stepped toward Spirit. The mustang stood still, head lowered. Cole raised the brush, hesitated, then dragged it down Spirit's neck. The sound of bristles on hair filled the silence. Spirit leaned slightly into the touch. Cole's jaw loosened, his hand steadied. For 5 minutes he brushed, saying nothing, but his shoulders lowered, his breathing evened. When he stepped back, his eyes glistened. He muttered, "Damn horse," and walked away. Henry hid a smile. Friday brought another shift. Lena sat cross-legged outside Sage's stall, her duffel beside her, reading softly from a battered notebook. Sage flicked an ear, turned, and stepped closer. For the first time, the mare stretched her muzzle toward Lena's hand. The young woman froze, tears springing suddenly to her eyes. She whispered, "Hey girl," and held steady. Sage touched her fingertips, then backed away, calm. Henry, watching from across the barn, felt something catch in his chest. It was working. Earl remained the hardest. He barely spoke, barely moved. He stood by the stalls each day, his silence heavier than the other's anger or fear. On Saturday, Henry approached him. "You don't have to talk, but if you want, Spirit's out back." Doesn't take words to be near him. Earl gave no reply. Yet later that evening, Henry saw him outside, Spirit grazing nearby. Earl stood 10 feet away, hands in his pockets, just watching. That was enough. By Sunday, the transformation was visible. The veterans weren't healed, not by a long shot, but they were breathing differently, standing differently. The mustangs mirrored it, their pacing less frantic, their eyes softer. That night, Maggie met Henry outside the barn. "You did it," she said quietly. Henry shook his head. "They did it. The horses did it. I just got out of the way." She smiled faintly. "That's exactly why it works." The following morning, Maggie handed Henry a new envelope. Inside was a letter stamped with an unfamiliar seal. Montgomery Equestrian Center, Lexington, Kentucky. "They've heard about you," Maggie explained. "About Spirit. About what happened this week. They want a demonstration at their facility next month. If we impress them, we'll have national backing." Henry stared at the letter, his stomach tightening. The thought of showing his fragile methods under watchful eyes, on a national stage, made his palms sweat. From the paddock, Spirit lifted his head, ears pricked toward Henry, as if sensing the storm coming. Was Henry ready to prove to the world what even he still doubted, or would the whole dream shatter under the weight of expectation? The train of horse trailers rolled east across endless plains, the sky a shifting palette of gray and gold. Henry Walker sat in the passenger seat of Maggie Holloway's truck, his hat pulled low, his eyes never leaving the landscape. Spirit traveled in the trailer behind them, steady as always, while Sage and 2 other mustangs made the journey as well. Their destination, Lexington, Kentucky, Montgomery Equestrian Center. The kind of place that made Silver Creek look small. National press would be there, wealthy donors, veterans groups, everyone watching, waiting to see if Maggie's vision was real or just smoke. Henry hadn't slept much the night before. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the veterans at Silver Creek Cole, Lena, Earl, standing beside their horses. Their breakthroughs had been fragile, delicate as glass. Could such a thing survive the scrutiny of strangers and spotlights? When they arrived, Henry felt swallowed by the sheer size of the place. Rolling paddocks spread for miles, white fences pristine as bone, barns tall and gleaming. Banners flapped in the wind. National Mustang and Veteran Healing Showcase. Henry muttered, "Hell of a circus." Maggie glanced at him. "It's a stage. And sometimes, Henry, the world needs a stage to listen." Inside the main barn, Spirit stepped off the trailer with calm dignity, drawing whispers from handlers and trainers who had gathered. His white coat shimmered under the lights, his presence commanding. "Is that the dollar horse?" someone murmured. Henry ignored them, stroking Spirit's neck. "Easy, boy. Just another arena. Just another fight." Sage was more restless, ears flicking nervously, but Henry spoke low, grounding her. He felt the tension in his own chest mirror hers. That evening, Maggie introduced Henry to the panel. Foundation directors, equestrian experts, and a few military officials in crisp suits. Their expressions were polite, but cool, skeptical. Dr. Caldwell, the lead director, shook Henry's hand. "We've heard remarkable claims about your methods, Mr. Walker. Tomorrow, you'll have the opportunity to prove them. The world will be watching." Henry nodded once. "I'm not here for the world. I'm here for the horses, and the veterans." Caldwell's eyebrow arched. "We'll see if that's enough." The next morning, the demonstration arena filled with spectators. Cameras lined the rails, reporters shuffled notebooks. Veterans from local groups sat in a reserved section, their faces marked by the same invisible wounds Henry carried. Henry stepped into the ring with Spirit at his side. No rope, no halter, just trust. The murmurs rose instantly, disbelief, even ridicule. Caldwell leaned forward in his seat. "Is this safe?" he asked sharply. Henry ignored the question. He raised his hand, palm open. Spirit circled him, free yet tethered by invisible threads of loyalty. With a subtle nod, Henry crouched low. Spirit dropped to his knees, then rolled onto his side, exposing his belly to the crowd. Gasps echoed through the arena. Henry's voice carried, calm but firm. "You can't force a horse to give you his trust. You earn it. Same with people." Next came Sage. Henry entered her stall in the arena barn, the crowd watching on a live feed. The dun mare trembled, nostrils flaring. Henry sat on the ground, cross-legged, reading softly from a worn book of Psalms. Minutes stretched, the crowd grew restless. Caldwell glanced at his watch. Then, slowly, Sage stepped forward. She touched Henry's shoulder with her muzzle, lingering. The arena erupted in applause. Henry rose, stroking her neck. "She's not broken, she's willing. That's the difference." Finally, Henry gestured to the veterans who had traveled with them, Cole, Lena, and Earl. Each stepped into the arena beside a Mustang they had connected with. Cole brushed Spirit's flank, jaw set but eyes softer than anyone had seen. Lena stood by Sage, tears streaking her cheeks as the mare leaned into her hand. Earl silent, stooped Earl stood with a bay gelding, his trembling hand resting steady on the horse's neck. Henry addressed the crowd. "These men and women fought battles overseas. These horses fought battles on the range. Both were caged by fear. Together, they remind us healing isn't about power. It's about trust, about breathing through the noise." The silence that followed was heavy, reverent. Then applause thundered, rising like a wave. Afterward, donors pressed Maggie's hand, pledging support. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing. Caldwell approached Henry, his expression transformed from skepticism to reluctant respect. "You've made your point, Mr. Walker," Caldwell said. "The Foundation will back Silver Creek." Henry only nodded, exhausted. Spirit pressed his muzzle into Henry's shoulder, grounding him. That evening, Maggie found Henry by the trailers. "You did it," she said softly. Henry shook his head. "We did it. Spirit did it. Those vets did it. I just stood with them." She smiled faintly. "And that's what leadership really is." They drove back to Colorado with the weight of victory in the air. Silver Creek's future was secure. The program would grow. The Mustangs would have their chance. Yet Henry's chest still carried unease. He thought of Maggie's secret meetings, of the folder she kept close. He thought of James's cold eyes, of whispers around the ranch. Back at Silver Creek, as they unloaded Spirit and Sage, Henry noticed the ranch too quiet, too watchful. James appeared from the barn, his voice clipped. "Congratulations, you've turned us into a charity showcase." Henry bristled. You got a problem with saving horses and vets? James's eyes narrowed. I got a problem with outsiders changing what worked just fine. Watch your back, Walker. Not everyone here wants this program to succeed. That night, Henry sat on the porch of his cabin, the sound of crickets filling the dark. Spirit grazed nearby, Sage lying calm for the first time. For a moment, peace seemed possible. Then headlights flared on the distant road. A truck slowed by the ranch gate, lingering too long before vanishing into the night. Spirit lifted his head, snorting, ears pricked toward the dark horizon. Henry's gut tightened. Silver Creek had just earned its future, but in doing so, had it also earned dangerous enemies? And what storm was now gathering on the edge of their fragile new beginning? The uneasy calm that hung over Silver Creek after the Lexington trip didn't last. By the second week back, Henry Walker felt it in the air like static before a storm. Spirit was restless at night, pacing the paddock. Sage startled at shadows she once ignored. Even the ranch dogs barked more often at the road. Henry trusted the animals more than people, and the animals were telling him something was wrong. It happened on a Wednesday night. The sky was moonless, the valley drowned in shadow. Henry had just finished stacking hay when a sudden crack split the silence. Not thunder. Wood. He ran to the mustang barn. The gate latch was splintered, swinging loose. Inside, Sage's stall stood open. The mare was gone. Henry's blood ran cold. He sprinted toward the fence line, Spirit galloping alongside as if answering the alarm. Headlights flickered down the dirt road too fast, too wild. A trailer clattered behind a black pickup, its rear gate swinging loose. "Sage!" Henry roared, the sound tearing his throat. The truck vanished into the night, leaving only dust and the echo of tires. Henry dropped to his knees, fists in the dirt. He knew this wasn't a random theft, it was sabotage. By dawn, Maggie stood pale-faced in the office, her hands shaking around a mug of untouched coffee. "It was James," she whispered. "I should have seen it. He's been against the program from the start, said it was turning Silver Creek into a circus. I thought he'd leave if he hated it enough. But he didn't leave, he struck." Henry's jaw clenched. "Why Sage?" "Because she's proof," Maggie said. "If he can make you fail, he can say the program was a sham, that you couldn't even protect the horse you claimed to save." Henry didn't wait for permission. He saddled Spirit bareback, the mustang quivering with shared fury. Rachel Porter, who had been visiting for a follow-up story, climbed into her Jeep. "I'm coming," she said firmly. Together, they tore down the mountain road, chasing dust trails and rumors. At the feed store, a ranch hand muttered about seeing James's truck heading toward an abandoned stockyard. By mid-afternoon, they reached it. Rusted gates, broken pens, a place forgotten by everyone except those with something to hide. Sage was there. Her dun coat gleamed with sweat, her eyes rolling in panic as she fought against a rope tied cruelly to a post. Nearby, James and two men stood smoking, their laughter cutting sharp in the cold air. "Thought you could make a hero out of a broken mare," James sneered when he saw Henry. "But now the Foundation will see the truth your miracle's gone." Henry dismounted, fists tight. "You're making a mistake." James spat on the ground. "The mistake was letting you in. This place was fine before you turned it into a sideshow." Rachel lifted her camera, voice steady. "Not anymore. The world's watching now." James lunged toward her, but Spirit screamed a piercing primal sound. The Mustang reared high, hooves striking air. The other men stumbled back in fear. Henry seized the moment. He darted to Sage, slicing the rope with his pocket knife. The mare bolted free, snorting, circling wildly before racing toward Spirit. The two horses pressed against each other, trembling but alive. Fury burned in James's eyes. He grabbed a metal pipe, raising it. "You'll regret this, Walker." Henry stood firm, chest heaving. "No, you will." "If you will." Before the fight could explode, headlights blazed across the yard. Sheriff's cruisers screeched to a stop, doors slamming. Deputies swarmed, weapons drawn. Rachel lowered her camera, triumphant. "I called them an hour ago, just needed you caught in the act." James froze, pipe clattering to the dirt. The arrests were quick, the silence afterward heavier. Sage pressed against Henry's shoulder, shaking. He whispered into her mane, "You're safe now, girl. You're safe." Spirit stood nearby, ears pricked, a sentinel who had never wavered. Back at Silver Creek, the Foundation representatives arrived within days, summoned by Rachel's story and the sheriff's reports. Instead of scandal, they saw resilience. Instead of failure, proof. Dr. Caldwell stood in the barn, watching Henry stroke Spirit's neck while Sage dozed nearby. "Your methods were tested under fire," he said, "and they held. The program isn't just alive, it's stronger than ever." Henry didn't answer right away. His hand rested on Spirit's warm coat, grounding himself. "Finally," he said, It's not about me. It's about giving second chances. Horses, veterans, sometimes even old soldiers. In the weeks that followed, Silver Creek transformed. New funding flowed. More mustangs arrived, nervous but full of fire. Veterans came too scarred, silent, searching. They found something in the barns and paddocks: reflection, patience, trust. Cole returned, calmer than before, helping newcomers find their footing. Lena began working part-time at the ranch, her laughter finally breaking through. Even Earl came often, silent but steady, sitting for hours by the horses he now called friends. Henry watched it all with quiet awe. Each day, spirit at his side, he felt the ghosts of war loosen their grip. Not vanish, but loosen, enough for breath to come easier. One evening, Maggie joined him on the porch of his cabin. The valley lay stretched under stars, the ranch humming with life. "You saved this place," she said softly. Henry shook his head. "No, the horses saved us." She smiled. "Then maybe that's the truth the world needed to see." Henry gazed at Spirit, grazing nearby, Sage resting close. For the first time in years, he felt not just useful, but whole. But peace never stayed long. Late that night, a package arrived at the ranch gate. No sender, no return address. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, lay a single photograph. Henry in Afghanistan, younger, rifle slung across his back, standing beside a burned-out village. Scrawled across the bottom in red ink were the words, "Some scars don't stay buried." Henry's hands trembled as Spirit nickered from the paddock, restless under the moonlight. Had his past just found him again, and what price would he pay to protect the fragile sanctuary he had built?